to the latest episode of Roland's Rant, and today I'm joined by David Rudolf for today's episode. David is a defence lawyer and best known for representing Michael Petterson during his murder trial, which was filmed by a documentary team and later became known as The Staircase, which has become a hugely popular show since its release on Netflix. So David, thanks a lot for coming on the show today, and how are you this morning?
I'm good, and thank you for inviting me.
No problem at all. So to kick things off, I'd just like to get an idea about your childhood. And you were born in New York, so I'm just curious to know, what was it like growing up there?
Well, I was born in New York City, but my family moved out to the suburbs on Long Island, about 30 minutes outside of the city when I was in third grade. And I grew up pretty much from then on until college on Long Island. It was sort of an upper middle class neighborhood. Back then, it was primarily a Jewish neighborhood. Most of the people I went to school with were Jewish. It was a pretty upscale neighborhood. I wouldn't say it was wealthy, but as I said, upper middle class. And it was a place where I didn't really want to stay once I got out of high school. But as far as growing up, it was a perfectly fine place to grow up.
Nice. And during the 60s and 70s, what were, say, some of the seminal events that shaped you as a young man at that time and obviously influenced your ideas and principles that you have with you today?
Yeah, well, and it was a seminal time for a lot of people back then. You know, when I was in, I guess, high school, you know, you had the Kennedy assassination. Actually, I was in junior high school for the Kennedy assassination, and then of course I got to college, and we had Kent State and the protests against the Vietnam War, and you know, the shootings at Kent State were very traumatic for me because I was a college student, and there were pictures of other college students literally being gunned down in the streets by National Guardsmen. So that was something that stuck with me. And then when I finally went to law school, of course, it was during Watergate, and you had the Attorney General of the United States being indicted. You had the Chief of Staff of the White House being indicted, the White House counsel being indicted, and ultimately articles of impeachment being voted against President Nixon and him resigning. So when you're in law school and all of that is going on, I think it starts to shape your view of what's important in terms of where you're going to pursue your career. And for me, that led me to a healthy dose of skepticism about government power and protecting individuals against the power of government. And I think that's sort of what led me directly to become a public defender, which was my first job.
You spent a bit of time in London University, if I'm not mistaken. And what were your steps from educating yourself in law to suddenly becoming that being your profession and then taking on some high-profile cases in the years that followed?
I was actually at LSE for a while. That was sort of a junior year abroad, and I can't say I took my studies very seriously. I was mostly enjoying London and traveling. So I'm not a product of LSE's great educational tradition. But when I finished college, I went to law school at NYU, which was a very progressive law school at the time. And as I said, right after law school, my first job was being a public defender in the South Bronx. And back then, some of you who are old enough to remember might remember Jimmy Carter as the president going to the South Bronx, and there were all these pictures of burnt out buildings that sort of looked like Dresden after World War II. And I worked up there. I worked in a upstairs office. To get to the office, you had to step over drunks and beer bottles. My office mate was Barry Scheck, who went on to represent OJ for a time and then formed the Innocence Project. And he and I have remained friends since that time. And I did that for a couple of years, and then I became a federal public defender working in federal courts. I represented a group. Actually, I represented a woman who was part of a group of Croatian nationalists back in 1976 who hijacked an airplane from Kennedy Airport and flew it over to Paris, dropping leaflets advocating for Croatian independence from Yugoslavia at the time. That was sort of my first taste of a high-profile, high-pressure case. And that was in New York, in federal court. I was a public defender. I was literally 2.5 years out of law school. I was a baby lawyer, and every newspaper from around the world was covering that story. So I was sort of thrown into the mix at an early age.
You've worked on high-profile cases, as you pointed out just there, but I'd just like to delve into the Alan Gell case, in which he was convinced of a murder he didn't commit. And you also mentioned on your website a more recent case in 2017 where Tim Bridges was wrongfully imprisoned for 25 years for a rape he didn't commit. So I'm just wondering, could you shed some light on these cases and what experiences you had during these particular cases?
Yeah, well, after the Petterson case was over, as I say during the filming, I was fairly well devastated by the verdict. And my career then began to morph a little bit, and I began to do what we call in the States wrongful conviction cases. In other words, I began to represent people who had been imprisoned for things they hadn't done. They had then been exonerated in various ways. And now, going back after they got out of prison, we were looking at why were they wrongly convicted? And was there anything that happened that was misconduct that caused the wrongful conviction? And of course, generally speaking, when there's a wrongful conviction, something has gone horribly wrong. Sometimes it's simply a witness who is mistaken. But a lot of times it's a police officer who became overzealous, became convinced that his theory of the crime was correct, and then shaped, to put it politely, the evidence to justify his conclusion. And that's what we found in the Alan Gell case. There had been, I think, something like 15 witnesses who had established that the victim had been alive at a time when Alan Gell had been already in jail on another minor charge. And those witness statements had never been turned over to the prosecutor, and therefore they were never turned over to the defense counsel. So it was a pure case of what we call the suppression of exculpatory evidence. This evidence would have proven that Alan Gell could not have committed the crime, and it was withheld. It was hidden. Once we found that, we sued those police officers and recovered, I think it was about $4 million for Gell. He had actually been on death row for 3 or 4 years. Luckily, his conviction was overturned before the death sentence could be imposed, and we ended up settling that case against the North Carolina SBI, the State Bureau of Investigation, for about $4 million.
Wow. And with the Tim Bridges case, the guy's in wrongful.
Tim Bridges was 25 years. Yeah, Tim was another case where something very similar happened. The detective had decided that Tim was the guy, and had sort of focused in on him. But there was another person who was in custody in another county who had actually admitted committing this crime. The police had that information. They had information that this other person had committed similar crimes in the past, had been in the Charlotte community, which is where this all occurred, during the time frame that this woman had been raped. But all of that evidence, as well as additional evidence, was withheld. And then they brought in an expert, a so-called expert in hair, who claimed that a hair found at the scene matched Tim's. Later on, this hair analysis was completely debunked by the FBI itself as being invalid. You couldn't say that this hair came from somebody else. The most you could say was that it was consistent with the hair of somebody else. So those two things combined resulted in Tim being freed after 25 years. DNA tests excluded him as the source of the semen that was found at the scene. And we went back and sued the police officers who had suppressed all that information and the hair analyst. And the city of Charlotte ended up settling that case for, I believe it was $9.5 million, which was 4 times more than they had ever paid anyone else. And the reason was that they didn't want all of that evidence coming out at a trial and sort of showing how they had done business back in the early 90s.
So to move on to the much highlighted Michael Petterson case, I'm just very curious to know how you felt when you took on the case first and foremost, but suddenly when you were approached by a film crew that wanted to film the entire process, because many lawyers, I'm sure, would have had serious reservations about constant filming being conducted inside and outside the courtroom. So did you initially think it was a terrible idea? And if you did think that, who convinced you to go ahead with the filming?
Well, the answer is yes. I thought it was a terrible idea. I was not in favor of it. And the way it happened was that Jean and his partner at the time, Denis Ponce, had just won an Academy Award for a documentary called Murder on a Sunday Morning. And they were looking to do another documentary on the American justice system. Murder on a Sunday Morning had involved a indigent person. They were looking for a case that did not involve an indigent person, someone who could afford a defense. And so they were referred to me because I had just finished a fairly high-profile case, the trial of Rae Carruth, who was an American football player who was charged with arranging the murder of his then-girlfriend. Any event, that had been covered on Court TV, and they contacted me. And my initial reaction was that I was not at all interested. But Michael felt strongly that the cards were going to be stacked against him in Durham, that he would not get a fair trial in Durham. And so Michael was very, very interested in having this very well-qualified, well-recognized film crew, documentary maker, watching over the trial. And he felt like if they were there in the courtroom and in other places, that perhaps the playing field would be more level. So he advocated for that. I talked with the filmmakers, and we had an agreement that number one, their filming would be at least to the start at the start for my purposes. Second, that they would send their film overnight to Paris, so that if the prosecutor tried to subpoena it, that he would not be able to get it. And third, that they would not release any sort of documentary until after the case was over. And so with those conditions, and I became convinced that it was a valid exercise to try to show people how criminal defense lawyers really prepare their cases and operate. You know, there's this sort of illusion among the media and the general population that somehow we try to manipulate things and we're unethical and we do whatever it takes to win. And I just thought it would be, at the end of the day, a good lesson for everybody to be able to see how a defense gets put together and presented. And so when you put all that together, I finally agreed, and they started filming pretty early in the process.
And you were saying it there, it gave a good insight into the behaviors of the lawyers and even the defendant's team. Did you, when the camera was being shown on you, did you ever have to conduct yourself in a different manner, or was everything we saw on the camera, you know, real life? Was it legit, or was there times where you kind of had to play to us?
No, we never, there was never a time when it was sort of like a movie set and I would be talking with Michael about something and somebody would yell, cut, and say, hey, can you do that again? Yeah. I mean, that just didn't happen. They were very, very respectful of the fact that they were there sort of just as a fly on the wall, if you will. They never interrupted me. They never asked me to change anything or do anything differently than I would do. Now, there were certain meetings that they simply weren't at, either because of their schedules or my schedule or for whatever reason. So it's not a complete record of everything that I did or every conversation that I had with Michael. But what's in there is absolutely real and real time.
To move on, and this is a question from one of the listeners, in relation to the murder or accident scene where Michael's wife, Kathleen, was found, many tests seem to be conducted throughout the duration of the documentary. And I'm just curious, and so are some of the listeners, they're curious to know if Michael and his family actually still lived in the house during these tests in early stages, even though there was evidence such as blood, hair, etc., still in the house at that time.
Yeah, and I've gotten a lot of questions about that on my Twitter account as well. And let me just explain what the process was. When I got involved, the very first thing I did was to preserve that scene as best I could. Now, I didn't get involved until probably a week after. But as soon as I got involved, we put up a big piece of plywood that covered up that entrance to that stairway at the bottom and also covered up the entrance to the stairway at the top. So nothing was visible from outside the stairway to anybody. And the reason I did that was in order to preserve it so that when I hired experts, they could come in and, Ron Jarrett, who was my investigator, could testify that we preserved the scene exactly as we got it. There's a chain of custody requirement that you have to be strict about so that no one can say you changed anything. And so we put that up. Ron put it up. He's the only one who ever took it down. And the only time we ever took it down was when one of our experts was actually there inspecting it for purposes of preparing for trial. So it's not as though the family was walking by that, on a daily basis and looking at it. There was literally a large piece of plywood that covered that entire doorway. Okay.
Well, that answers it pretty comprehensively. So to move on, say, into the episodes and deep into it, how important was the bisexual element of Michael's life for the prosecution team? As it seemed to me that they really did focus on that to create an uncertainty nearly amongst the jury. While also, and you've said this before and interviewed yourself, it also seemed to distract them away from some of the foundings you and your team had managed to find.
Well, and I think that's exactly right, and it was very intentional. When the prosecution doesn't have a strong case, the idea is to try to prejudice the jury against the defendant, because that makes the jury less likely to pay careful attention to the weaknesses in the case. And that's exactly what they did. So this bisexuality stuff had literally nothing to do with what happened on the evening of December 9th. I mean, Michael had a separate life before he met Kathleen. He was bisexual. That was sort of an understanding between them that that's who he was. And the reality is that the witness they called, Brad Wogemont, had been contacted 3 months earlier via email. He had never met Michael. He had never had any kind of personal contact with Michael. And Michael had, in fact, told him during a couple of email conversations or phone conversations about Kathleen and how great their relationship was. And he testified to that at the trial. So, given the fact that that was 3 months before anything happened, it had zero to do with the case, but it had a lot to do with assassinating Michael's character, and that's really what the purpose was.
Mm. On the point of Michael's character and trying to nearly manipulate the ideas the juries would eventually make of his character, you wrote on your website recently that Michael was, to quote, was not someone who showed emotion easily in front of strangers, which ultimately led you to get Josh Carton, who was the trial consultant you knew from prior cases, to help Michael open himself up and to eventually show emotions he was feeling that you felt would be important in the jury's case. So I found this whole entire sequence in the documentary very fascinating, very interesting. And I'm just curious, the question I want to ask is, how important is the presentation of the defendant in relation to shaping the jury's idea of the man or woman they see?
Well, what you have to keep in mind is that from the moment potential jurors enter the courtroom to go through the selection process until the moment that a verdict is announced, those jurors are watching the defendant virtually every second. They may be listening to the evidence. They may be watching a witness or a judge or a prosecutor or a defense lawyer from when they're speaking, but inevitably they're going to be glancing over at the defendant every day for long periods of time. And so it's really, really important that the defendant understand that he realize that his every gesture, facial expression, movement is going to be scrutinized by a jury, and they're going to draw conclusions from that, consciously or subconsciously. So you simply have to prepare your client, if you're going to be a competent defense lawyer, for that eventuality. And I do that in every case. It's not just in high profile cases. I go out of my way to make sure the jury sees that I really care about my client. I'll put my arm around my client when I'm expressing concern so that the jury can see that this is a real thing for me. I've often, I'll often bring gum or lifesavers to court with me and, pass some to my client or pour a glass of water for him. And the whole idea is that I want the jury to understand that this is a real person to me. This is not just the defendant, and that I truly care about this person. I think that's really important for a jury to understand that this is not necessarily just a job for me, but it's more than that.
Yeah, no, that's an interesting point. And on that topic of the relationship a lawyer and the defendant would have, how important is it for you to not get too emotionally invested in a case? And I know it must be very difficult not to, with all the work you put in and outside the courtroom, and you get to know the defendant, you get to know his family, his friends. But is there a certain line you draw in your own mind where you do not want to get too emotionally invested in it? Because ultimately, at the end of the day, you need to deal with the facts and you've got a job to do, and that's ultimately to defend the defendant.
It's interesting because you'll hear a lot of lawyers say that I've never really believed that. I think that jurors understand when somebody is emotionally invested in what they're saying, and when it's more dry and just clinical. And I think there's a real difference. If you're a juror and you're watching me defend somebody, and you can see that I really believe in what I'm saying. It's not just a show. It's not just a job. It's not just a dry presentation, but it's part of me and important to me. I think that has more impact, more persuasive impact than if I'm simply up there without the emotion. So I know that that's counter to what a lot of lawyers believe and say, but I could never separate myself from my emotions. Now, if it's negative emotions, if I don't like my client, that gets harder because I don't want to show that, obviously. But where I'm really invested and believe, I don't really see a downside other than to my own psyche if the case doesn't go well, to feeling that emotion.
And it's interesting you highlighted the fact that you're an emotional guy. You like to get your emotions out there. To touch on a scene where, from a viewer's point of view anyway, it was pretty hilarious and also a tense scene at the same time. It was the night before the trial began, in which you were trying to get your presentation organized and you're getting interrupted by people. There's a police officer saying there's smoke in the building, and you're lambasting someone's PowerPoint skills by saying the system sucks. I'm curious to know, how tense and how nervous do you get yourself the night before a trial or the day before a trial? Is it like, say, an athlete before a big sporting occasion? Like, are you on edge, or at this stage are you calm, relaxed?
When I'm not on edge, it will be time for me to retire. So the answer is yes, I'm always on edge. And I think, to get maximum performance, whether you're an athlete or an actor or a lawyer, that edge is an important thing, to maximize your own performance. I will say that I think that the inclusion of that scene will tell you, number one, that there was not any retakes
Yeah, exactly.
of anything. And number two, that they didn't necessarily spare me when I lost it.
Yeah.
And I have to admit that it wasn't at all funny to me at the time. But when I look back at it now, it is sort of like a comedy routine with the guy popping in right in the middle to tell me there's a fire in the building. It's sort of like, are you kidding me? This doesn't happen in real life, but it did.
No, it was fascinating to see. And throughout my time watching the series, I never really, and this is a spoiler, so any listeners stop right now, I never really expected to hear a guilty verdict, as there seemed to be plenty of holes in the prosecutor's case, along with, as we already discussed, pointless aspects of Michael's life being brought into the spotlight and used to harm him, essentially, which, in my view, showed an element of desperation on their part. But with all that said, with all the work you put in, how devastating a moment is it when you find out that you've worked your socks off, you're confident, as we saw in the documentary, confident that you're going to hear not guilty, and then it goes against you? How devastating is it a blow? And as a lawyer yourself, do you find yourself questioning your methods and skills?
It was probably the worst moment of my professional life. And it wasn't just me who thought there was no way it was going to be a guilty. Everybody who sat in that courtroom on a daily basis, the sheriff's deputies, who obviously you get friendly with over the course of a 5-month trial, the court clerks, the reporters, the various media people who were there every day. No one thought that there would be a guilty verdict. To this day, I cannot understand how 12 people looking at that evidence could not have a reasonable doubt. Whether they thought Michael did it or not is sort of besides the point in our system. But how they could not have questions in their mind, reasonable questions, is beyond me. Having said that, it was completely devastating and made me question myself in fundamental ways. You know, what had I missed? How could I have not seen this coming? You know, what should I have done differently? Those are all questions that you know obviously ran through my mind for weeks and months after that verdict, and it was a really difficult time for me because you know I had always had a fair amount of success in my trials, and this one hadn't gone. The trial had gone beautifully from my perspective. You know, I had accomplished everything I set out to accomplish. Every witness who was important who testified against Michael, I felt we had destroyed during the cross-examinations. So, you know, when you're feeling that way and you're not feeling like, oh, geez, this trial just went awful, you know, I'd never expected this, and then the verdict goes against you, it really causes you to question really whether you were watching the same trial.
Yeah. No, it was, as a viewer, it was a shocking moment. And the after effect of that is it's a big moment in the series when you were on the phone to Michael, and it just seems that you are emotionally spent, as you've said there, after the trial, and you tell Michael that it's unlikely that you can do it all over again. I'm just curious, how was it? Like, how was it for you to tell a guy who you've worked so long with that it's out of the question for you to do it again? And then I suppose to follow on from that, what eventually made you change your mind to help Michael, albeit not in a full-on capacity, but to some capacity, you know, what ultimately changed your mind to help him again and enable yourself to get invested back in the case?
Yeah, well, it was very difficult to tell Michael I couldn't do the trial, but let me give you some context about that. Once we got him the new trial, I stayed as his lawyer for another 4 years. And during that time, we had tried to resolve the case because we all felt on the defense side that this was a case that just should be resolved at this point. He had done 8 years. You know, Deaver had been exposed as a complete liar. And there was just no point in going back through another trial. And Michael just wanted it over, and I couldn't blame him. So I tried my very best to just settle the case. But Kathleen's sisters, and particularly Candace, who you got a sense of during the documentary, had an inordinate impact on the district attorney's office. They wanted to settle it, was my take, but they didn't want Candace yelling at them the way she yelled at us. And so at some point it became clear that it probably was going to have to be retried. And I had moved on in my life. You know, I had moved to Charlotte. I had gotten divorced and remarried. I had a baby at the time. Well, at that time by that time she was 5. And I wasn't emotionally prepared to go back in time and relive that again. And so I just felt like I had to tell Michael that. But I also found him a great lawyer in Mike Klinkasum. And, you know, I told Mike Klinkasum, whatever you need, I will be there for you. You know, I will meet with you, go over the evidence. I can't be the person who's in the courtroom for another 3, 4, 5 months in this case. And that's how I felt. Now, unfortunately, Mike Klinkasum has a massive stroke. Like 2 weeks before he's supposed to have this hearing on a motion to dismiss because the prosecution had tainted the physical evidence.
And when the news broke about the lawyer suffering a stroke, did you contact Michael straight away? Because I'm sure once that happened, Michael was thinking, here we go again?
I immediately called Michael when I heard that, and I said, Michael, do you want me to come and do the hearing? And he said, no. Mary Jude Darrow can handle it. We think that Judge Hudson is looking for a way to get rid of this case. And and so I didn't. Then in November, when that hearing took place, I actually attended the hearing because I just wanted to be there if, in fact, the case got dismissed. And I watched. Different lawyers have different styles, and I don't know Mary Jude Darrow, but I'll just say that I personally was not happy with how that hearing went, and I left the court that day feeling very badly about what had happened and about the fact that now they were going to be going to trial, and Michael had her as the only lawyer. I mean, that was it. And Michael then called me the next morning, literally the next morning, and he basically said, David, I have to go to trial here, and I can't do that with her. It's not going to be good. And so I agreed at that point that I would at least get involved in an effort to try to resolve the case. And so when I got back involved, I hadn't made a full-on commitment at that point to actually do the trial again. The commitment I made to Michael was that I would come in, I would file some motions which I thought had needed to be filed, which hadn't been filed. And then once we filed those motions, I would again try to resolve the case. And then if that didn't work, we would see where we were at that point.
So to fast forward to current day, and with the documentary coming out and with many articles and even YouTube videos being made about it, one of the big things and the big topics right now is the owl theory, because it's sort of blown up recently and seems to be a lot of social media and a lot of sites seem to be split down the middle, as some people think it's potentially a legitimate theory while other people think it's nonsense potentially. I'm just curious to know, what is your take on the owl theory? Because I know you learned about it, several years ago, and it was probably too late in the case to, really investigate it. But if that had come to you at an earlier stage, do you think that could have changed the whole dynamic of the case?
Well, it's hard to say, because it was a different time and you didn't have, YouTube videos of people being attacked by owls and all of the evidence that would now support that kind of theory, through social media and other things. So I don't know how it would have gone in 2003. What I will say is that I completely think that that's a plausible theory. Indeed, I think it is by far the most likely theory of what happened. It explains virtually all of the physical evidence. There were drops of blood outside the house, which we just assumed was from Michael running out of the house to see where the EMS ambulance was. We never thought that she had started bleeding outside. But there were drops of blood right on the walkway outside. There was a twig of some sort in dried blood, which we knew about, but at the time, I figured it must be from the Christmas tree, or something like that. It never occurred to me that it could have been from a tree outside the house. Then there was this little piece of something that no one could quite tell what it was. It turns out that was a feather. When you start considering all that and you consider the wounds on her scalp, which never made any sense to me as a being from blows struck by a blow poke or anything else, but the way my experts recounted it, they were splits, in essence, which came from landing on a flat surface, and that seemed reasonably logical to me. But now, in hindsight, when you look at those wounds, it is so clear that they are from a talon, if you will, a 3-pronged talon on each side of her head. I mean, you just look at it, there's one on each side.
And personally, yourself, what do you think happened that night? Was it a murder? Was it an accident? Was it an owl? What took place the night of Kathleen's death?
I think what happened was that that owl attacked her outside. She was out there rearranging the little reindeer that they had in the front. And I think an owl attacked her out there. I think she started bleeding. She ran inside. The blood started pouring out. She was disoriented. I think she probably tried to run upstairs to get towels to put on her head. And I think she lost consciousness. I think she was out for some period of time, and the evidence supports that. And then she stood up and fell back again. And I think some of the wounds towards the bottom of her head are from falls in the staircase. And she died of a loss of blood. She didn't die from trauma to the brain. And in something like 250 cases in the previous 10 years, there had never in the history of North Carolina, a case where someone was beaten to death with some object and there wasn't either, a brain injury or a skull fracture. So you put all that together, Richie, and I don't see how that's not the most plausible theory. And I certainly would have used that theory at a retrial had it come to that.
Yeah. No, it is. It is a truly fascinating thing to investigate or even think of right now.
Well, and all you need to do is Google owls attacking people on YouTube, and there must be 50 or 100 videos of that happening.
Yeah.
So why wouldn't that be a plausible explanation?
The last question I'd like to ask you is it's just about yourself and what does the future hold for you? Would you still like to work intensely for another several years? Would you like to take the backseat eventually, or would you ever even consider writing your own book about your experiences in the field of law?
Well, every trial lawyer has considered writing his own book about his own experiences. So that's part of the ego of being a trial lawyer, I suppose. So sure, I've thought about that from time to time. I just never ever could imagine finding the time to actually sit down and do that. I've had some incredible cases over the last 30 years. Really, really interesting stuff. But who has the time? In terms of my more immediate plans, I've got 3 or 4 wrongful conviction cases that are going on right now, which I fully intend to finish out. I've just been approached about maybe doing a murder case on a retrial, which I'll think about. Do I ever talk about slowing down? Sure, I talk about it with my wife and my 8-year-old daughter all the time. And the general consensus is that it probably won't happen.
And just to finish, I normally, with the podcast, I do a quick fire question round. And if you'd like, I'd ask you a few questions. And if you could say the first thing you can think of. And I know as a lawyer, you might have to think about what you say, but rest assured, if it is in any way incriminating, it can be deleted swiftly.
Okay.
But we'll get going. What is the strangest thing you've ever seen in a courtroom?
A juror literally passing out from looking at a pornographic video. No. A juror passing out from being told what was in a pornographic video that they were about to be shown.
Oh, wow. That is most definitely strange. What is the worst advice you see or hear being given in your world, and in your case, the law world?
Just cooperate. Everything will be okay.
Which person do you admire most and why?
In the world? In history?
Yeah, in history.
Nelson Mandela.
And why?
Because, he and Desmond Tutu, because the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that they set up and utilized, I think is one of the most amazing devices for healing a country that has ever been thought of. And for him to endure what he endured for all those years in that prison and then come out and have the grace and the generosity and the wisdom to know that that's what he needed to do for his country is just mind-boggling to me. And I think we may need a Truth and Reconciliation Commission in the United States in 2020.
And last but not least, and this is by far the toughest, describe yourself in 3 words.
Passionate, committed, and unafraid.
Well, that concludes the podcast, David. So first and foremost, I want to thank you for coming on. I've really enjoyed getting to know the insides of your career and the many insights into the Michael Petterson case, and I'm sure the listeners will love hearing about it too. So thanks a lot for that. And listen, I wish you the best both inside and outside the courtroom in the future. And I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you very much. Will I be able to listen to this at some point, or how do I listen to it in the United States?
I can link it to you via email great. And also on Twitter.
That'd be great.
Okay. Well, thanks a million for your time, David.
Take care, Richie. You have a good day.